Amy Metcalfe is Head of Programmes and Finance at the responsible investment charity ShareAction, where she leads the Workforce Disclosure Initiative. The initiative is backed by 120 institutional investors with 13.5 million assets under management, who are asking for greater workforce transparency from global corporations. In 2018, the initiative received data from 90 corporations, headquartered in 16 countries, covering 11 sectors. Amy is well placed to talk to us about how investment can drive action in responsible sourcing. Amy, welcome.
Hi. I'm Amy Metcalfe. I'm Head of Programmes at ShareAction, and ShareAction is a responsible investment organisation based here in London. And I'm going to tell you about the Workforce Disclosure Initiative. But first, I'm going to try and ask you a question. So let's see if this works, hopefully. So in your apps, to what extent is investor interest in your company's workforce already affecting your activities at the moment? Interesting. So, it's creeping up. But a clear indication there that there is some interest, but you're not getting a lot of questions. So I'm here to explain that that interest is coming, if you don't have it already. So the Workforce Disclosure Initiative was launched as a response to investor concerns that corporate reporting on workforce issues just wasn't giving them the meaningful and comparable data that they were looking for. ShareAction has worked with institutional investors for many years on the UK living wage. But when we talk to them about engaging on wider workforce topics with a wider audience, it became really clear they just simply didn't have the data to do that. The global head of responsible investment at AXA, when we started this, told us, I'm quoting, so I'm reading, as companies have been reinforcing their disclosures on environmental topics over recent years, we wish to see a similar effort with social factors. Companies should disclose data that is material, consistent, and comparable enough to truly understand their approach to workforce management. The WDI is at the end of its second year, and today we've launched our report on the 2018 data. Now, as was already said, we've got 122 institutional investors with 13.5 trillion assets under management backing this. Those investors are based in 14 countries. We're funded by DFID, by UK Aid, and we've worked in partnership with Oxfam over the last 2 years to link what we're asking at the top level to the worker experience on the ground. We also work with RIA in Australia and Share in Canada to really extend our reach to make sure we're working with organisations that understand the local market and can engage with local investors and local companies. WDI picks up the idea that decent work is not only a question of risk management, but also a question of how companies and investors contribute positively to sustainable development. Now, we had a great session earlier today on the SDGs, and they are highly relevant in this context because it's the first universally adopted expression of such global goals. Goal 8 on decent work sits at the heart of those commitments. Its delivery can help to unlock other goals, such as reduction in poverty, improvements in education and health, and the attainment of equality and empowerment of women. The popularity of the WDI shows that there is investor appetite to go beyond a compliance approach and to link business strategy with continuous improvement over time on social impacts. That investor appetite is growing, and the number of investor signatories is up 50% on the pilot year. So, in 2018, we received data from 90 companies. Those companies cover 8 million workers in over 100 countries. and they have supply chains that include 1.5 million firms. The companies are everywhere. We've got 21 of the global top 100 by market cap. We're really pleased this second year that we're starting to break out of Europe, and we've got a handful of US companies and even a couple of Asian companies reporting to the platform. The survey is deliberately sector agnostic, and we're excited that we've got data from all 11 GICS industry categories. We're also really pleased that we've got 91% retention rate of companies that delivered data in the pilot year and again in 2018. Companies like Unilever, Microsoft, Nestle, Inditex. And that tells us that companies are really starting to build this into their reporting cycles. We've also had some great discussions with them about how doing this has helped them to understand the gaps in their data and has helped them to break down some internal silos between HR, between sourcing, sustainability, to start to understand their workforce better as well. We've also seen a higher quality of data from those companies that are disclosing for the second year in a row. Now, the WDI is a deliberately broad survey. It covers governance, workforce composition, turnover, learning and training, health and safety, and workers' rights. Investors are interested in understanding how a company approaches workforce management, not just for headquarters staff, and not just for the direct operations, but throughout the supply chain as well. The investors really understand that companies do not have all of this data at the moment. And in 2018, we classified the questions into foundation, intermediate, and comprehensive. Investors are expecting that companies can respond to the foundation level questions with data on the bulk of their operations. And they're asking for a direction of travel, for companies to set out how they're going to move to have the intermediate and comprehensive level data over time. For the first time in 2018, we also gave companies a disclosure score privately, which talked about the quantity of data they gave us. And that's the average for each of the sections is up here, that's the number that's on this graph. Today, I'm going to focus on what we've learned about the supply chain part of that. Now, only 50% on average gave investors information about their supply chain structure. And we found the breadth and depth of that information was massively varied. 77% answered that supplier sourcing section. And that's because the vast majority of companies do have responsible sourcing practices and strategies and policies, which is great. But there was a much more varied set of answers on how they then measure that those practices are actually being adhered to by their suppliers. Then we get down to the workers' rights section, which again was much more patchily answered, and that aptly named stretch supply chain questions, which was our comprehensive level questions. And this was things where we were asking for workforce composition, for learning and training, for and turnover. So increasingly, investors are going to want to see how those policies translate into action and how that supports business performance and sustainable development. So I'll keep talking throughout about why we think investors are looking for this data and what we're hearing, but I'm going to dig into a few of the findings from our 2018 report. So firstly, you'll see in our report that more than half of the companies didn't provide detail on who's involved in their risk management processes, how often they happen, and which part of the business they cover. When we look at risk management for the supply chain, only 29% of the respondents were able to articulate how their sourcing strategy identified risks and how those risks shaped their actual purchasing decisions. Now, I know that you are doing a huge amount to think about the workforce risk in your supply chain. We've talked about that a lot over the last couple of days. But we need more of this information to get to the investors. We need to tell them how you identify risks and help them understand how you engage with those risks and how you address them. Help guide investors to engage with you on the topics that really matter to your business success and the ones that have the most impact on workers. Secondly, we ask for disaggregated data about all of the workforce. 98% of companies gave us some information about the gender split of the direct operations employees. That drops to 52% for contingent workers and right down to 17% for the workers in the supply chain. In that 17%, there were a couple of really good examples. For example, Sainsbury's gave us a great breakdown of the gender balance across their supply chain. And we were really pleased to see that companies were saying they were using Sedex data to help them interact with their suppliers in this area. But gender was the best picture. When we looked at age, disability, ethnicity, the disclosure numbers dropped again. Now, investors are starting to recognize and engage on the fact that companies have enormous influence over the way different demographic groups access labor markets and flourish in the workplace. They want to see that companies are committed to providing equal opportunities and are monitoring that disaggregated data to start to identify if there are any structural barriers to achieving this. Finally, I'm going to talk about the finding around low-paid workers. So only a minority of companies reported data on their lowest paid workers, and only 13% gave us data across their entire operations on wages. The good news is that 78% of companies say that they have a policy on wages in the supply chain. 50% of them say they're actively engaging with their supply chain firms to improve wages, but only a handful could describe what the impact of that engagement was on the wages in their supply chain. Now, investors are increasingly engaging on this issue. There is a Dutch coalition of investors called the Platform for Living Wage Financials that have been looking, starting at living wages in supply chains for garment workers, but are now looking to food and agriculture as well. And they've used information from the WDI to both look at wage levels and to look at worker voice, collective bargaining rights, to engage with companies on that. Investor expectations are rising. Investors want to understand workforce impacts because they're under increasing pressure from their clients and from regulators to show that what they're doing is really making a difference, which is part of the driving force behind a number of initiatives in this space. People like the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark and Know the Chain are benchmarking subsets of companies on specific workforce issues. Investor alliances are popping up and wanting to understand this better. We are working with all of these players to make sure that the WDI is complementary and that we understand the links between all those things. We're also really mindful that companies are asked to report on a number of different platforms. Reporting fatigue is real. And so we are working very hard to make sure that we align the WDI questions with the other reporting frameworks out there, and that we fill the gaps for the data that is not being gathered for investors. So what are our signatory group doing? Well, certainly in the pilot year, I'm pretty sure a number of them signed up because they were going to get some free data. But over the last year, we've been really impressed with how much they want to engage. A third of our signatory group have had meetings with around 150 companies to ask them to disclose and to dig into some of those workforce topics. One of our signatories is already using this data to inform an employment-focused fund, and we expect that to happen more as the investors get to grip with the breadth of this data set. We're going to do more to encourage this interaction. We're going to have a workforce conference in June where we get investors and companies together, firstly to talk about disclosure and the challenges to gathering this information, but also to dive into a couple of issues, probably around gender and around living wages. And we will continue to convene smaller groups of our investor signatories that want to engage on key topics and get them in the room with the companies that are interacting with this. So, how can procurement practices lead to better outcomes by 2025? My small piece of that. Firstly, keep championing the workforce being the heart of business management and decision making. Help investors to understand how you do this and what's important for your business. Guide them to engage with you on the salient issues. Don't leave them to fill in the gaps for themselves. Gather disaggregated data across your supply chain on workforce composition, on hours and wages. Explain to investors what they show. Explain the issues that are coming up and what you're doing to address them. Investors will increasingly want to understand the actual impact to workers of your policies, your practices. Keep working on how to measure that. And finally, anticipate greater scrutiny from investors. I hope that if I was to poll this again in a year, that number would be much higher. Encourage your company to engage with them and use that interest to help further what you're trying to do. So please do have a read of our report. There's a few copies at the back, or it's online. We will be publishing a few pieces of deeper dive analysis or more sector specific over the next few months, so look out for those. And we will be coming out in 2019 to be asking a much wider group of companies to disclose. So we will look forward to talking to you about that then. Thank you very much.